So I've been thinking about experimentation for a while. Bard's been working on federalism for a long time. So this is our joint effort to talk about these things simultaneously. So given I'm new to the federalism literature, it's an obligation that I start with the requisite or required federalism quote from Justice Brandeis 80 years ago. So as he says, it's one of the happy incidents or coincidences of the federal system that a single courageous state may experiment, release information and make everyone better off. All right, so this is a very optimistic view of federalism, that we decentralise power, everyone's off running their own little experiments, it's like one large laboratory, and this experimentation process, this laboratory, reveals lots of information that's really valuable. We all learn what good policies are, and off we go. All right? This is, not, as I said, an optimistic view. It's a good view, all right, but it has several presumptions that we're going to try to explore in this paper today. One of those presumptions is, or one thing that it ignores, is the possibility of free riding, and that the chance that free riding here, if experimentation is costly, is going to undermine the incentive to experiment, and such this federal laboratory may not work as well as we think. And the other thing we're going to look at is the idea that these experiments are necessarily useful for everybody. All right? So when we think about politics and policy, we usually think of there being preference differences. All right? So when we think about preferences differences, it's not obvious that some states running experiments, even if they find a good policy, it's not obvious that that policy, that successful experiment, is going to be useful to everyone else in the country. All right? So it may be without cost to the rest of the country, but it's not clear it's going to be with any benefit to the rest of the country.
Well, Brandeis didn't say that there were benefits, just without risk.
Without risk, okay, yeah, so that's right. So we're going to, that's our point. It's not clear. I think it would have been implied that there was a benefit.
What's special about federalism? Think about different states.
Yeah, nothing special about fed. Yeah, exactly. Nothing special whatsoever. So particularly, yeah. So that's another thing he doesn't. We agree entirely. All right. So all he really means here is some decentralised decision-making process. You don't need a federal system for that information to be shared. So, all right. What we're going to talk about will go beyond it and put some structure on it and create some differences. All right, so for example, we often see California experimenting with environmental standard type policies, Alabama and conservative states with school voucher type policies. All right, these things are very different, and it's not clear that if California finds a nice way to tighten environmental standards, that this is a policy that other states are going to want to imitate. So it's not clear that experiment's going to be beneficial to these other states. So the questions we're going to get at today are, will states choose the right quantity of experiments? All right, so will they experiment sufficiently? Will they overcome their free riding problem? This question's been looked at a little more. The more novel question we're going to be asking today is, will they choose the right type of experiments? And not only are they experimenting enough, but are they experimenting with a socially efficient set of experiments that releases information that's valuable to the entire country, or the entire set of countries? All right. So our contribution is going to be the following. We're going to set up a model with essentially those two components as the key elements. We're going to give the states, the districts, the countries the choice of choosing whether to experiment or not, and we're also going to give them the choice of which policy to experiment with. All right, and we're going to have this in a setting where there's some preference, heterogeneity and policy differences. The first bit of good news is that, the only bit of good news is that preference differences mitigate free riding. All right, so it's not a surprise that as we start to move away in the policy space, I'm less inclined to want to free ride off you, so we're not going to have as bad a free riding problem. I'm going to be more willing to experiment because I'm less able to benefit from your experiment. All right, so the good news is that that's why perhaps California experiments with liberal policies, precisely because no one else will. All right, they can't rely on anyone else to tell them how to find a good liberal policy, so they have to go do it themselves, and free riding's not a big issue. So that's the end of the good news. The bad news is, and the first bit of obvious bad news, is that these experiments, therefore, that they run and they come up with are less socially useful. All right, because they're experimenting in different parts of the policy space, what California comes up with just isn't as useful to the other parts of the country. So it's not the case that one state just has to get lucky and then suddenly everyone's got a good policy that they can implement. All right, so they're kind of straightforward good news and bad news. The really bad news and the more kind of subtle effect that we're going to present is that not only are these experiments less socially beneficial, but the interaction of free riding and these preference differences are going to interact in such a way that it's going to lead to them to experiment with Pareto-dominated policies. All right, so it's not just that California is experimenting with something they really like, and Alabama or Texas is experimenting with something they really like. The interaction of preference differences and the free riding problem is going to force them to choose Pareto-dominated policy choices. All right, so the interaction of these effects is worse than we may have thought. All right, so the good side is that this free riding problem is mitigated by preference differences, but what we want to highlight is that this can lead to real distortions in the policies they choose to experiment with.
So, if you didn't have the preference differences, wouldn't the free riding problem give you a Pareto-dominated outcome anyway? I ignored the externalities, so...
Yeah, so I'll be a little clearer what I mean, the kind of distortion I'm going to come at. All right. So that's the first contribution. It's really a paper with two parts. So that's going to be our first contribution. So in a completely decentralized system, whether we think of it as a decentralized federal system or just a set of countries learning from each other, these preferences, differences, and the possibility of free riding is going to lead to a distortion in the policy choice. Then we want to ask the question, well, can we design a federal system that overcomes these problems and leads to better outcomes? And it's here we're going to put some structure on what the federal system is. All right. So federalism is really the sharing of power across levels of government. Brandeis's view is really just fully decentralised, as Gillard was pointing out. And so this is pretty much the same as having no federal system whatsoever, just a group of separate political units making decisions and learning from each other. So the question we're going to ask is, can we design a federal system which has a more effective way of sharing power, or a way of sharing power that's more effective and provides the right incentives to experiment with the right policies? And the answer we're going to come up with is what we can call progressive federalism. So it's going to be a dynamic conception of the federal system. So the way it's going to work is that early on in the process, we're basically going to have a three-stage game. Early on in the process, the states, we start with a decentralised system and we end up with a centralised system. So early on, the individual states, individual districts or countries get to choose which policies they want to experiment with. At some point down the road, they're going to lose that control and then we're going to end up with a centralised system. All right, so that's why we call it progressive federalism, or perhaps progressive centralisation is a better term. All right, why does this system work? Well, what we're going to assume and impose is that centralisation requires policy harmonisation. So when we centralise, there's going to be a central authority who chooses which policy we all have to implement. All right, so why is that important? Well, what then happens is at the early stage of the game when we're decentralised, the states are choosing or experimenting with policies in the shadow of future centralisation. All right, so they know at some point a central authority is going to impose a policy on everyone. What they're going to be doing early on in the process, essentially, is competing with their policies to win that later decision. All right, so they want their policy to be the one that's adopted at the federal level and is imposed upon everyone. All right? So if I try to choose a policy and Francesco's doing something else at the other extreme and mine doesn't work and his works, I'm going to have his imposed on me at the later stage. All right, so now I'm setting up a system of incentives where I'm competing, or my policy is competing against Francesco's to win at this later stage and be imposed uniformly at the federal level. Oops. All right. So,
Steve, so you started saying that there's something that you want to experiment on and Francesco wants to experiment on something else. And now you're forcing the centralized government to pick one of those things, even though you are putting cap on emissions and Francesco is...
Yep. Yeah. So I'll explain it clearly later on in a little while, but what I'm doing is exactly, I'm imposing ex post inefficiency on this system. I'm going to force us to do the same thing. And what I'm going to try to show you is that's going to change my ex ante incentives in such a way that I'm going to avoid the distortion I talked about on the previous slide.
When I'm doing the same thing, it's a different... You're doing the same thing on one policy, because we can do the same thing with many different policies.
Do the same thing with many different policies.
Right, everybody has to have this cap, everybody has to have this.
Yeah. So what I'm really proposing here is a different mechanism of this federal system. And at this stage of the paper, all I'm going to do is say, here's one where I'm imposing exactly the same thing on everyone. I think it doesn't need to be so rigid, and there's a kind of open question as to how you would I'm going to give you something that's better than the decentralized system. The question about what's the optimum is still open. Yogi. I'll give you the model in a minute, but no. All right. So usually in the federalism literature, there's this coordination benefit where we want to coordinate and harmonise, and everyone in Europe want to talk about the benefits of harmonisation. What we're going to show is that we will have a world where the federal system imposes harmonisation, even though there's no explicit benefit for doing so, and in fact, it's going to be ex post inefficient to do so. All right. So in a way, we're saying there's harmonisation. The argument for harmonisation is the incentive mechanism rather than just some benefit of it. So whether it's there or not, I'm not going to take a position on, but we're going to assume that there isn't an explicit harmonisation benefit to just distinguish ourselves.
I mean, in principle, a social network will run different experiments in different states.
Yeah, so this an unresolved question, at least for me coming at this literature, is it's never full, well, at least formally it's not fully explained why we can't do that. All right, so at some level we're going to implicitly lean on the assumption that the central planner can't do that. There's going to be effort involved or something like that where the central planner can't do that. All right, but it's true, unless we're going to have some moral hazard problem or some deeper problem that we're not going to model, it's not clear why the central planner isn't doing, just imposing the optimal experimentation pattern. But that's the case with lots of papers in this literature.
So just on this, is that related? So what does it mean, our answer? So that's optimal within what scheme?
All we're going to show you is it can perform better than a fully decentralized system. It's not, I'm not going to claim it's an optimal mechanism, but it's going to be better, and I would think that the optimal mechanism is going to be something that looks like it. And we can talk about the specifics later, but we're pretty much at the stage of brute, coarse mechanisms at the moment.
But if it's exposed inefficient, how implementable is it? And why should people stick to it?
That's a good question. I'll try to come back to that later on. But that's why you need a federal system. That's why we can't do this in a decentralized way. But we'll come back to that later on. All right. Okay, so the final thing perhaps to take away is, so the metaphor, the approach, seeing that Brandeis wanted to use a metaphor, and his metaphor was a laboratory with some kind of social planner organising this. The metaphor we want to push in understanding federalism is that it's more of a policy tournament than a laboratory. All right, so the states are offering policies which then compete in this tournament to win at the federal level when we are ultimately centralised. All right, related literature. There's surprisingly little formal stuff on experimentation in federal systems. There's a very large, lots of papers and books talking about this. Not as many models as you might think. In fact, there's only a handful of papers that really model this free riding problem. And they're all kind of nice papers, but nothing too deep, whereas they pretty much just capture formally this free riding problem, where I might not experiment so I can benefit from your experiment. The only paper I know of that has preference heterogeneity and experimentation on a quasi or a formal federal system is one of Mike King's papers, but Mike restricts it to two policies, so there isn't this policy choice that we're going to try to get at. Which is surprising in that a lot of the empirical work on policy diffusion in federal systems really has as a key explanatory variable the similarity or differences across states. All right, so in studies of Bolden in particular has done a few papers on this, studying policy diffusion across the United States, and the key variable you're looking at is how similar are these states, and that the learning transmits across similar states. All right, so the preference heterogeneity there seems to matter a lot for how policy diffuses in federal systems and how they learn from each other. It just hasn't been in models up until now, and that's what we're going to try to do. Per Gilad's point, this last paper, whose names I won't try to pronounce, they've got nothing to do with federal systems, but they're about learning across countries and trying to explain the last 50, 60 years of economic development through a kind of policy diffusion story. And it's exactly the same as learning in these federal systems. It's just countries learning from each other.
How is it related to these papers on experimentation teams like the Bolton, these people are there? Yes.
Okay, so there is a big literature, of course, on experimentation in economics. $10 for Marco for setting it up. These guys are much more sophisticated in what they do. They have an infinite horizon. They're solving their dynamic program. We're not going to do anything like that. And as Marco pointed out, starting with Bolton and Harris, there's been a literature on experimentation in teams. And so it's all about free riding. But they don't have this preference heterogeneity aspect that we're going to get at. I haven't seen the point, well, they don't have models in which there's differences in preferences, and so it's different or weakening or strengthening the incentive to free ride. And they certainly don't have anything on the strategic choice of your experiment to affect the free riding problem. All right, so yeah, maybe an optimistic view is we're contributing something to our literature, which is this point that free riding is a function of our preferences, all right, but we've obviously got a much more simplified model of experimentation than this literature is dealing with. All right, so here's the model. It's, as is always the case, it's going to be as simple as we can make it to make our point. So policy is going to have two components. We're going to have an ideological component. This is going to be a standard single-dimensional policy space. And there's also going to be a quality component, which is going to be a public good. So if an experiment works and it's good quality, that's good for everyone who implements it, regardless of the ideology and your preferences. We're going to assume the ideology is perfectly controllable and it's the quality that's unknown. So if you experiment with a policy, you're choosing an ideology and then you experiment with it. That ideology is fixed. It's the quality that's uncertain and is an output of whether the experiment works or not. This is the same as Mike does in his paper. It's not essential that one dimension is controlled and the other is the stochastic element. We could balance these out however we want. All we're trying to get at, all that's key, is the trade-off here between the kind of common good element and the ideological component. So to make things easy, we're going to lock one of those dimensions down, the ideology. We're going to make it even simpler. The experiment's going to be binary. It either succeeds with probability k. So if you choose to experiment, if it succeeds, it's quality 1. If it doesn't succeed, it's quality 0. It succeeds with probability k, and running that experiment costs, probability p, and running the experiment costs k. We're going to have two districts or states. All right, so everything that's kind of district slash state slash countries is exactly got that point that it doesn't need to be a federal system. So their ideal points are in the real line. They're TA or TB, and we're going to parameterize the heterogeneity or the preference difference between them by a little h. All right, so the timing is very straightforward. So there's 3 stages. All right, so in the first stage, essentially, or the first 2 stages, it's you experimenting with each state or district experimenting with a policy. So you choose an ideology, a location in the policy, in the ideology space, an xi. All right, then you choose whether to experiment or not. We then all observe whether my experiment works and whether your experiment works. All right, then in the final stage, we each get to choose which policy we implement. All right, so this is the decentralized timing. When I talk about progressive federalism, I'm going to change that final stage, but everything else is going to be the same. All right, so here it's fully decentralized. I choose a policy to experiment with, Tom chooses one to experiment with, or we choose whether to experiment or not. We all observe the outcomes. And then in the last stage, I can either keep my own policy or I can switch to Tom's policy. All right, now obviously if my experiment fails and Tom succeeds, then I might switch to his. If his is away from my ideal, further away from my ideal point, I might switch because I'm getting the better quality outcome. Payoffs are just pretty much that, quality minus the ideological loss, minus whether you paid for the experiment or not. And so this C is the function of your ideological loss if you're at a different point to your ideal. So we're going to assume C is concave, as derivative of 0 when you're at your ideal. So you can just think of quadratic loss here if you want, make things simpler. All right, so I'm going to start with the first best case. So suppose we've got 2 players and we're experimenting. So if I was on my own, all right, the logic here would be pretty straightforward. I would never choose any experiment at any policy other than my ideal. All right, and if the payoff of experimenting dominates the cost, I experiment, otherwise I just stay there. All right. Now we have 2 players. All right, I've got a choice. All right, if my experiment doesn't work, I can switch to Tom's. All right, and so I have some utility. There's an externality if Tom experiments. This is the kind of basis of the free rider problem. So if I start with the benchmark case of what's the socially efficient level of experimentation and policy, we're going to have to trade off those 2 things. Question?
So I can see that you condition your policy on the relative success of what other people do. So, but I mean, you have your voters in your district, and you can see that they make a lot of pressure on you that dislike something. And I would see the accumulation occurring as, even if you're in a bad outcome, everybody has a bad policy. At one point, somebody has to do something, and I think our needs often are like substantial, often in situations of bad situations. So there's also an absolute component, I think, that you may not consider.
Sorry, I thought you were saying something about the incentives of politicians to experiment in this system, but now then I heard you say something about the absolute.
Yeah, the absolute, I mean, you know, in my region, if I do something very wrong, I mean, the people respond to this, right?
Okay, you can get, yeah, so.
You're not you want to be re-elected, or, you know, there are protests, whatever.
Yeah, so we're ignoring the idea that there's a politician here who needs to get re-elected, and so kind of can't have is going to be more reluctant to experiment because if it's a bad outcome, they'll get thrown from office. We're just, I think they're very valid political economy concerns in this exact type of setting. We're just not going to deal with them here.
Okay.
All right, so what I have here, so the idea is I'm at negative h over 2, Tom's at h over 2. That's his ideal because the difference between us is a total of h. So obviously if I experimented at my ideal and I get a good quality, I haven't drawn that, I get 1. But if I have to switch to Tom's ideal, I'm getting quite a bad I have to pay this ideological cost, and that's got quite a bad, significant cost to me. All right. So what the social planner is trading off here is, what's the kind of benefit to me of having to switch to Tom's experiment if his works and mine fails, and vice versa? All right, now our assumption on this ideological loss function, say it's a quadratic loss function, is that me moving a little from my ideal with my experiment essentially has 0 marginal cost at the start. All right? But if Tom's experiment should fail and he wants to switch to me, that's a significant gain to him. All right, so I'm going to exploit the concavity of these ideological loss property to say that the socially efficient outcome here is for us to actually choose experiments that are convergent from our ideal points. All right? So it's not efficient for me to experiment at my ideal and Tom to experiment at his ideal, because if mine fails and his works, I've got to jump all the way there. He'd happily move a little towards me as long as, and if I move a little towards him, we're all better off. We're obviously not going to both jump to the centre because there's a possibility that both of our experiments will fail or succeed, in which case we've all paid the ideological cost for no benefit. So we're kind of trading these things off, and the first best is going to involve some convergence of their policy. All right? With the caveat is as long as we're not too far apart. All right, so here's a graph that Bard came up with. It took me about a week and a half to understand what he was doing, so I probably should pause and explain. It's a nice, now I agree it's a very nice graph, but it took me a while to figure out. So what we've got here is their equilibrium, their policy choices on the horizontal axis, and the vertical axis is parameterizing how far apart we are, our heterogeneity. So if h on 2 or h is really high, so the idea is if they locate on the 45-degree line, that means they're locating at their ideal point. All right. So if the little bit that's highlighted at the top is meant to be green, so if that whole line was green and it was saying for every level of h we went to the 45-degree line, that's saying we locate at our ideal. All right. So the little bit of green at the extreme is saying if h is sufficiently high and we're sufficiently far apart, then the efficient thing is for us to just locate our ideal. All right. And the cut point for that's straightforward. It's the point at which I'd rather have my own failed experiment than jump to Tom's successful experiment, pretty much. All right. So if we're really heterogeneous, we just experiment at our own deal. That's the first best. But if we're less than that, the efficient level is for us to converge towards each other. All right. And the convergence is we're getting closer together as h is getting smaller. The final little bit the one line that's at the bottom is if we get close enough together, the socially efficient thing is for only one of us to experiment and for the other guy not to experiment. All right. So social efficiency is kind of saying we should converge in our policy choices. All right. So there's a range of heterogeneity between h prime and h double prime at which it's socially efficient to converge. It's socially efficient for us both to experiment and for us to converge. And the amount of convergence, this value of little a, is just given by a first order condition. I will point out the left-hand side's just like balancing off the ideological loss. The right-hand side is if P1 minus P. So in our context, P1 minus P is the probability that Tom's experiment fails and that mine succeeds. And so that's going to be the probability he wants to switch. And so this is going to be a key probability throughout. All right. So now let's think about what happens if we're in a fully decentralized system. And let's suppose for the start that I'm going to fix locations. So if I'm going to fix locations, and suppose I fix this at the same ideal, at the same point, all right, then we've just got a kind of classic or straightforward free rider problem. I'm only going to experiment, if Tom's experimenting, I'm only going to experiment if my marginal gain, P1 minus P, exceeds my cost. All right. So if that condition isn't satisfied, I'm going to free ride off Tom and not experiment. All right, now what I want to say is, well, how is that condition affected as our experiments are moving apart? All right, and as we're moving apart, I'm less inclined to free ride because I have to pay an ideological cost to switch to his point. So this ideological cost is this kind of difference of C terms on the left-hand side. It's the ideological loss of Tom's point and my point. All right. I think too much to take from that. So what I then want to say is if this first condition on P at 1 minus P and K is not satisfied in that we won't experiment if we're exactly at the same ideal point, The only way we can get us to both experiment is if we're experimenting at different policies, if we're pushing each other apart, and we actually have some heterogeneity in our preferences. All right, so if that condition k minus p, 1 minus p is greater than 0, and we've both got the same preference, one of us is going to free ride and we're not going to get both experimenting. All right, so this kind of differences in the policies we're experimenting with is key to getting us both to experiment. So this is, how much time, what time did I start? I even look. Oh, I got lots of time. All right. Very good. All right, so what I want to think of here on this graph, I've got A along the top axis. So A is how much I move from my ideal towards Tom's ideal. All right. So the left-hand quadratic is my ideological loss from my ideal point, and the H is from Tom's. All right, so what this is trying to say is, well, if we get too close together, neither of us will, well, one of us will want to free ride an experiment. So the only way I can get both of us to experiment is if we're choosing policies that aren't too close together. Right. Now, if we're a long way apart, that's fine. We're going to both experiment at our ideal points. Tom's got no incentive to free ride and jump on mine. But if our ideal points get too close together and we locate at our ideal points, Tom would stop experimenting and want to jump to my point and free ride. Right. That's bad for me because I'm paying the cost of experimenting and Tom isn't, so I don't get the externality from his experiment. So the question is, how can I induce Tom to experiment so I can free ride off him? What I need to do is I need to make my experiment less attractive to Tom so he's less inclined to free ride. How do I make it less attractive from him? I move away from him. All right. What does that mean? Well, it means we've got ideal points here. I'm going to actually experiment with a policy outside that, outside that interval of our ideal points.
You think about mixed strategy equilibria where you experiment with some problem?
We haven't thought about mixed strategy equilibrium, but
It still would probably be inefficient, I guess.
yeah, it'd still be inefficient. I mean, you're not. So the point is, I've got no incentive whatsoever to move towards Tom in a decentralized system. All I'm doing is making it better for him and worse for me. Anytime I move away from my ideal, it's worse kind of at an absolute level in terms of the policy, and I'm making his incentive easier to free ride. All right, so even if I mix, I'm going to be mixing perhaps at my ideal and outside. But I haven't thought about that much, so I don't want to make any claims. All right. So in a decentralized system, there's absolutely no incentive to converge, but in fact, there's going to be an incentive to diverge. All right. Because what I'm trying to do is weaken Tom's incentive to free ride, and the only way to do it is to make it less attractive to him by paying a cost myself. All right, so this is the basis of my claim of Pareto-dominated policies. This is what I meant to be precise. They're going in equilibrium. In many situations, they're going to choose policies that are Pareto-dominated for everyone. They'd all be better off if conditional on the same level of experimentation if they moved towards the centre. All right. So if I let them choose their equilibrium locations, this is the plot of what the equilibrium behaviour looks like. All right, so this is again my graph where H is on the vertical axis, so that's parameterising the degree of heterogeneity, and their equilibrium locations are on the horizontal axis. So if they're on the 45-degree line, they'd be locating at their ideal points. So again, we get this situation where if their H is high enough, the equilibrium is they both locate at their ideals. And that's again the case that Tom's not going to free ride off me at my ideal, so he's going to experiment, everything's good. All right. But for this intermediate range of heterogeneity, Tom would free ride off me, so I try to dissuade him from free riding, encourage him to experiment, and I do that by moving away from him. Right. As our ideals are getting closer together, right, I have to actually get further away from him to induce him to not experiment. So that means this kind of wing that comes out here, it's not just a progressive increase, it like bends backwards. All right? So in fact, in absolute terms, the policies we experiment with are getting further apart in this interval, in this range, as our heterogeneity decreases. So as our ideal points get closer together in this interval, the policies they choose are actually getting further apart in absolute terms. And if we get close enough together, then the equilibrium is one of us experiment at our ideal and the other guy free rides. All right, and this is a function of that k. If k, the cost of experimenting goes to 0, this bottom interval just disappears. All right. So this is the formal statement. If H is the heterogeneity is in some interval, all right, the equilibrium involves divergence. The first order, the amount of divergence is given by this first order conditions. The divergence increases in K but decreases in P. And the smaller is H, the larger is the divergence. All right, so this last inequality is just saying exactly what I said a minute ago, which is the absolute positions are getting further apart as their preferences are getting closer together. So in this range, they're really choosing distorted policies. One thing to note, this first order condition in the first bullet point, it's very similar to the one I gave you in the first best, except now it's got this p squared on the denominator. All right, so all my later trade-off of these different systems is going to turn on how this right-hand side changes. All right, so that's what happens in the decentralized case. Let me tell you the centralized model, or this is progressive centralized model. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to have exactly the same game, except I'm going to change stage 3. All right, so instead of in stage 3 you get to decide which policy you implement, yours or the other person's, what we're going to have is essentially some social planner comes in and implements the same policy for everyone, and they're going to choose that policy according to what maximises social welfare. All right. Another way of thinking of it is that there's a median voter halfway between these two states. You can think of it like we're two states, we all join into one country, the median voter's halfway. If we give full power to that median voter and require them to harmonise policies, we get the same outcome. All right, so that means if we're at a symmetric location here around that median voter or around that central person, this median voter is going to choose the policy that the experiment that succeeds over the one that fails. If they're both fail or they both succeed, they'll toss a coin as to which one to choose. All right, so standard stuff. So as we talked about before, this imposes ex post inefficiency. All right, so it's going to say even if we're symmetric, both of our experiments succeed, the efficient thing is to let each of us implement our own experiment. All right, this is saying we're both forced to go to one point or the other. Otherwise, the game is as before. All right. All right, so you've got a choice. You can either read the slide or you can listen to me. You don't have to do both. So what's happening now? Well, so now we have a policy tournament going on. All right, so now suppose we're we're both thinking of experimenting at our ideal point. All right. Before I moved away because I wanted to increase Tom's incentive to experiment. All right, now I also, in addition to trying to induce Tom to experiment, because that's good for me, all right, I have to ensure or hope that I win the tournament at the final stage and have the median voter implement my policy rather than Tom's. All right. So what I'm trying to do here is with my policy experiment is win the favour of the median voter. And as we all know from median voter models, what's that going to do? That's going to create an incentive to converge. All right, because now I want Tom to experiment and I want to appeal to the median voter. What I need to account for is, well, how does this convergence affect Tom's incentive to experiment? All right, is it going to cause him to not experiment? Well, it turns out in many situations here, his incentive to experiment in a progressive federal system is increased, all right? Basically because he's got this extra payoff in many situations that he's going to be forced to jump all the way to my ideal point, all right? Perhaps when he doesn't want to, if he doesn't win this tournament. So in the model we've set up, it turns out that these incentives are the cut point for where this transitions is going to be a half. All right? So, and you can see that from, again, it's the same kind of expression, C's on the left, K minus P1 minus P on the right, and a P over 2 there. All right, so as long as that denominator is less than 1, the incentive to experiment is larger in the progressive federal system. All right.
So Steve, did you think about considering in the centralized system also sharing the cost of experiment?
Yeah. So we spent a lot of time trying to fiddle with this as to what would that mean and how would you share that cost? I don't think we ever came up with a good answer. And like it tied into what Francesco was asking about, why can't a social planner impose this? And then,
well, you could have like, NSF grants.
Yeah, so we thought about that. Not in political science, yeah.
That's a failure.
Yeah.
But I'm saying,
yeah,
so I'm going to do some experimentation, so it's a natural way of thinking about it.
Yeah, exactly. So we have thought about it. We haven't given up on it, but because we hadn't solved this problem of, why can't a central planner just impose everything, and we're not trying to model that, we figured we weren't quite ready to answer that question. But absolutely. and this comes back to, we've got a very crude progressive federal system here. It's either everyone does the same thing or everyone does the same thing. It could be, you know, that we all do the same thing. If Tom chose this policy, we don't do the same thing in this situation. We could give him money, you could give me money, and all this sort of stuff. I do think that's all very interesting. We have tried to think about it, but we haven't quite, particularly on that question, figured out what to say or how to model it yet.
Why do they compete for the region? You have two different regions, and you're symmetric in our borders. So why would I care whether I win or lose?
Why would you care if you win or lose? Because if you lose, because you're in a federal system, all right. So you've ceded authority to some higher government, and that government is going to choose the policy for you, and they're going to force my region to do Tom's policy if the median voter in this whole country likes Tom's policy more than they like mine.
What I understood is that in those regions, the voters are identically distributed. So then the median is supposed to vote.
Well, yeah, well, so I wasn't very clear about, even explicit about how I'm thinking of the median voter. But these districts have different preferences. So if you think about them identically distributed but around different means, then the median in the whole country is going to be, say, somewhere halfway between them. Okay.
So one assumption that's apparently important for you is that if you experiment with policy X and it succeeds, it tells you absolutely nothing about what happens at policy X plus epsilon, X minus epsilon. So which kind of exposed pretty much kills any scope for renegotiation, haggling, moving around. And so my question is basically, would all the insights go through if you allow for some of that?
Well, so the haggling and the bargaining ex post would be part of some richer mechanism, and we're not doing that. But the first part of the question is, well, exactly, we're assuming there's non-transferability of whatever information you gain from this experiment. If I experiment at this point, if it works, that's fantastic, but if I move epsilon to the left, I don't know how to do that. So this is the angle I was coming at from this paper. I have several papers on policy experimentation that tries to model that transferability of information from what you learn. All right, so it's obviously unrealistic to assume that this information is perfectly transferable. I shouldn't be able to experiment over here with, carbon trading system and somehow that tells me all about a Marxist system at the other end of the spectrum. So the transferability is very imperfect here. It's certainly not zero, it's somewhere in between. All right? So this whole Brownian motion stuff I've been yabbering on about for years is meant to capture and parameterize this transferability. Everything we say here goes through as long as that transferability is low enough. We haven't bothered going through and figuring out what the exact bound is, and we're just taking it to the extreme to make it simple. All right? But it certainly does rest upon a belief that the transferability isn't very high. Where what is very high is I have no idea what that cut off.
So here's now a centralized government that can decide which policy is going to implement. So something and say, oh, now we're doing this. But it's not making any contracts regarding what I want you to do. So there is this possibility of saying, look guys, I want you to do this. This is a complete information game. I know what's the ideology. Do this, do that. After, if you don't do this, I'm going to do whatever punishment I want. And you're doing that centralized government the same power that it has with yours. And that's going to prevent the first phase, right?
And that's going to what?
That government is going to prevent the first phase.
So I think you're asking Francesco's question, is that right? Did you understand that?
Yeah.
So
normally the same model is exactly the same.
So of course we're assuming that we can specify which government has authority to implement policy at different phases. That's part of the mechanism. If I understand what you're saying, which is, why don't I just let the central government do everything right at the start?
No. Just say, look, I'm going to do whatever you want, but if after what you do, I'm going to react in this way.
Yeah, I'm going to react in this way. What do you mean this way? So that's what we do. That's the whole point. We say you can do whatever you want for the first period. I'm going to react in this.
Condition what you do on whatever you want to do. So
whatever you're doing. We're not saying who's designing this system. So yeah, you can say I have one government that rules these 6 people. I can say, well, I'm going to divide you into units. You 3 figure out something good. Even if they're lined up on the line, you figure out that something good. And then in the third stage, I'm going to pick the best.
No, the other thing that it does is create contracts. There are fictitious, completely fictitious. It says, look guys, you are that. If you have to do this. If you don't do it, I'm going to implement that. And the only power that I need is the same power that your government has. Yeah. And so I need an argument to see why
Why can't they do it? No, exactly. I think, well, this question is my answer to Francesco's question. This applies to the whole federalism literature. All right? Why isn't it just one planner at the national or grand level who says you experiment with this, you experiment with that, otherwise I'm going to shoot you? We don't try to offer an answer here other than to say nobody in the literature does, but everybody who writes verbally or non-formally about this seems to think that's an unrealistic possibility. But I agree entirely, just from a mechanism design perspective, if the central planner has if the median voter at the national level has full power, then they could just say, Tom does this, I was pointing at the two Toms, Tom 1 does this, Tom 2 does that, and so on. All right. We're going to just assume they don't have that power and rely on a literature. All right. But I do think that's an open question to explain or to provide, well, you could say there's moral hazard, there's unobserved stuff and this and that, you know. There's some complication. I do think there's value in trying to provide a theory of exactly why it's difficult for the central government to specify complete contracts. But we're just not doing that here. All right, okay, so what happens in the centralised case? So it turns out for some of the parameter values that we want to converge. Turns out it doesn't always happen that way. So basically the idea is I want Tom to experiment enough that's kind of weighting, the way we've set it up, that weights against my desire to win the median voter. So in some situations I'm still going to diverge because I want to induce Tom to experiment, because his experiment is valuable enough to me. I'm happy that ex post inefficiency isn't enough to dominate my ex ante incentive. But for certain ranges of H, I'm going to converge. All right, so what you should be thinking now is in the decentralised case, they were diverging. In the centralised case, we're converging. And convergence was what first best efficiency was requiring here. All right, so that's going to be the basis of our argument as to why this progressive federalism can lead to better outcomes than decentralised system. All right, so centralisation is always ex post inefficient. If P is greater than a half, your incentive to experiment is lower. And I'm not going to go into detail of it. Why the half is, I mentioned it a little earlier, why it's the cutoff. But if it's greater than a half, my incentive to experiment is lower in a federal system, then the ex post inefficiency just is a cost, so centralisation is going to do worse. But for P less than a half, for a big range of the parameter value here, centralisation can do better. All right, and we can, for quadratic C functions, I can calculate exactly the cutoff point in these parameter values for why this works. All right, but I'm not going to try to give you any intuition for that. All right. So,
a question. These experiments are experiments in which the province is running the experiment and living with it for a while. Is that the way you think of it?
Yeah, that's
and later on.
Yeah.
Okay, so now can you play with the interval? That is how long the living goes on. Because you think, okay, if it's actually inefficient to have the central imposition, why not wait a few years? How about 100 years? So you live this way, the incentives are all there, it's only a question of discounting how much, to play it that way. So you don't have to suffer that much ex post inefficiency.
Yeah, exactly. So we had thought about the time period in terms of it might take you a while to learn whether your experiment is working or not. We hadn't thought about it as part of the mechanism, the federal mechanism as to when that cut point is, but absolutely. Yeah. So as I said, we've got the fully decentralized system, and we've got one specific crude federal system here, which is we impose this ex post inefficiency. I'm not going to claim we'd like to get a result of this form at some point, which is what is the optimal mechanism. It might involve harmonisation to some degree. It might involve delay. If you choose policies that are this far apart, I'm not going to impose federal harmonisation until stage 7 rather than stage 3 and a bunch of other stuff. All right. I absolutely think the optimal federal system isn't going to look exactly like this, but there's going to be some ex post inefficiency to change the ex ante incentives. All right. So basically that's our main result. It's a very simple model, and there's lots of other things we can try to do. All right. Yeah. I won't say anything more. All right. So yeah, that's our main result. The ex post inefficiency of this federal system is trying to change. Then we have some other interpretations. It's late in the day. They're not very good applications, so I'll talk about them later. But yeah, basically we're trying to look for any situation where there's a joint decision process and we benefit from each other's effort or experimentation or action. And what we want to show is that these kind of mechanisms of forced inefficiency can improve our ex ante incentives. Does this actually happen in the wild? As far as we know, there's no constitution that actually talks about harmonisation in this way. There's lots of stuff I've read, and Bard tells me to read on European harmonisation, where they talk about it as all the Europeans have got to love each other, and that's why we've got to harmonise, and this kind of stuff or whatever. We're offering a very different interpretation, but I haven't seen anything out there saying, describing it in this way so that we can point out and say this is a smoking gun supporting our theory. All right, so what I'll try to give you is some anecdotal evidence and some distant evidence to try to kind of point out that would be consistent with our model. Tom? Oh, excellent. All right, so it turns out Riker, like many different areas in political science, wrote a kind of very beautifully written and insightful book on the topic. So he wrote a book on federalism, and he tried to characterise these things as centralised and peripheralised federal systems, where centralised was there's more decisions made at the centre versus peripheralised systems, more decisions are made at the extreme. He said he described the dynamic in these federal systems, how centralised or peripheralised they were, on every federal system in the world that started after the US started. All right, and his conclusion is that increasingly centralised systems succeed and increasingly peripheralised systems fail. All right, there might be many reasons for that, but at least it's consistent with what we're saying. What you want to have is this progressive centralisation, a progressive centralisation, and that's the incentives you want to have. All right, now obviously I don't think Riker would have written about Europe, but he definitely wrote about the US. Big example in this data set is the US and the growth of the central government. All right, there's a million books written about this. No one seems to say this, but our point is that it's the increased centralisation which is providing incentives amongst the states to lead to better outcomes. I'm not saying that's the whole story, but that is our point. It's part of it. I've talked about harmonisation. In the empirical literature, there's lots of stuff about learning across states. There's also several papers on how the federal government learned from the states. And there's also some evidence of this dynamic going the other way, most prominently in welfare policy in the United States, where the federal government pretty much said, and there's nice quotes about this, we don't know what to do on welfare policy, we're going to push it back to the states and let you guys figure it out. All right, my expectation is that at some point they might centralise this again. All right, and so that's the dynamic we're trying to get at. We push it out, let you guys figure it out, give you an opportunity to figure out a policy that works for you, create a kind of tournament, and we'll bring it back to the centre later on. And the final defence is this is, of course, a prescriptive theory. This is what they should have been doing, even if they didn't do it for the last 200 years. And that's it for me.